Okay, so now we're going to be talking about social psychology, which is the next chapter that we'll be talking about in our final module, Module 5. So, this is the scientific study of how our thoughts, feelings, and actions that we have or engage in are affected or influenced by others. So, social psychologists consider the different kinds of behavior and causes of behavior we engage in when in social situations. So they examine how these social situations influence what behaviors we engage in. So essentially, social psychology is the branch of psychology that studies social interactions, including the origins of these interactions, so how they've developed and the effects they have on the individual themselves as well. So essentially, this is how attitudes, motivations, personality, and behavior are both influenced by your social group, and in turn, how all of those things influence the group itself. So, social psychologists will ask questions like, how can we convince people to change their attitudes and adopt new ideas or change or adopt new values? They'll ask things like, how are we influenced by what others around us do and think? So, how are our own behaviors influenced by those around us? Other questions they might ask are, why do some people display things like violent or aggressive behavior towards other people to inflict harm on them, while other people will risk their own lives to help someone else? And what are the differences? What is going on there with those two different types of behaviors? So, these are the types of things that social psychologists look at and study. So, we're going to start with talking about attitudes, which shape our behaviors, and these are how we form judgments of others around us. So, attitudes are evaluations of other people, objects, ideas, and behavior. So, we have attitudes about all sorts of things. So, you have attitudes, or you can look at these as thoughts about other people. So, you can say, I think my parents are great, right? So, thoughts about other people. You can have attitudes or thoughts about behavior. I hate when my kids leave toys all over the living room, right? So, that's an attitude about a certain behavior of sort of leaving messes in a certain place. You can also have attitudes or thought about abstract concepts or ideas. For example, I support the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So that's a more abstract or concept idea that you might have a value or attitude around. So, persuasion involves the process of changing or trying to change people's attitudes. So, that's sort of everything I was talking about, all of those thoughts and ideas you have about people, about their behavior, about um, abstract concepts or ideas. Persuasion is trying to change those things, right? So, it's trying to change people's thoughts or ideas about all of the things that I previously mentioned. Now, whether or not one's attitude can be changed, or the ease of which an attitude can be changed, is going to depend on numerous factors. So, first, the source from where the persuasive message is coming from matters. Um, the characteristics of the person delivering the persuasive message also has a major impact on how effective that message will be in changing people's attitudes. Studies have shown that people considered to be more attractive see greater change in attitudes from their persuasive message. Additionally, their expertise or their trustworthiness will play a significant role in how effective the message might be, unless the audience thinks that the person giving the message or the communicator has some ulterior motive. So, this explains why a lot of people, are hesitant when they hear, for example, politicians talk or try to persuade them one way or another because we assume that they always have some ulterior motive. So their persuasive message may not be as effective because we view them as having an ulterior motive. The next factor that influences how effective a persuasive message may be is the characteristics of the message itself. So it isn't just who delivers the message, but also what the message is like. So, for example, fear producing messages are often very effective. Um, if they also provide the audience with a solution to reducing the fear. So, for example, in the 90s, this is when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, AIDS was a really big concern. They were sort of still figuring out how to combat this disease, and it was very scary for people because we didn't know a lot about it. So, the message, if you don't practice safe sex, or in other words, use condoms, you will get AIDS. Okay. So the fear part of the message is there. So now this is a persuasive message, right? It's trying to convince people to practice safe sex, right? So if they had some view before or idea before that there was no need for condoms or safe sex, or limiting your sexual partners or something like that, this message was trying to persuade that idea. Okay. So the fear of the message is there. You will get AIDS, right? Which at the time in the 90s, that was a death sentence. Okay. They didn't have a lot of the treatments that they have now. And back then, if you were diagnosed with HIV and then if it went into full blown AIDS, you probably were not going to live for very long. So that's the fear portion of the message. But the message also includes a solution, which is to practice safe sex, right? Use condoms or use protection. So these messages often work well, again, if it has a fear component, but it also has a solution to that fear. Additionally, things like two-sided messages are typically more effective. So if the communicator presents not only the side they support, but also the side they're arguing against, then their message is better received. The final factor that influences the effectiveness of a persuasive message is the characteristics of the target or the audience. So these are the individuals who ideas you're trying to change, you're trying to persuade. Okay. Now, generally speaking, more educated individuals are less likely to be influenced by persuasion. Additionally, some studies have shown gender differences with respect to levels of persuasion. In public settings, women are more likely to be persuaded. However, if we're looking at a private setting, then men and women show pretty equal amount of change in attitudes. Now, historically speaking, women were expected to either not have an opinion or share the opinion of the men around them, right? If we look back in history and sort of what was the societal role of women. So you can sort of see how this tendency, when in a public setting, to change their ideas more willingly had evolved, right, historically. This will, though, and hopefully will change with the advancement that we're experiencing in the women's rights movement, especially in recent years, where women don't feel so, I would say, forced or feel the need to agree with everyone around them, right? Like they're finding their own voice and the ability maybe to not be so easily persuaded just because, the men in the room think a certain way. So, but we do, in studies and statistics that people have looked at these persuasive messages, we do see sort of these general gender differences when looking at public settings. Okay. Now, how receptive any one individual is to persuasive messages is going to depend on the type of information processing that they engage in. So, social psychologists have identified two different types of processing. They've looked at what is called central root and peripheral root processing. Central root processing occurs when an individual evaluates the message with thoughtful consideration of the issues and arguments being presented. So if these individuals change their attitudes, those that use the central route processing, it's due to logic, it's due to the merit of the message and the strength of the argument. Okay. Whereas peripheral route processing occurs when an individual is persuaded by factors unrelated to the actual issue. So these individuals change their attitudes based on extraneous factors such as who is delivering the message, or what the person delivering the message is wearing, or what they look like. Maybe the length of the message or the emotions used to deliver the message. So these are all factors that are unrelated to the actual content or issue of the message itself. In general, individuals who are motivated and fully interested in the topic of the message use central root processing, whereas individuals who are disinterested or unmotivated or distracted tend to use the peripheral route processing. Even though both of these types of processing do produce some level of attitude change, in general, we typically see with central route processing that the changes in attitude or the results of those changes are stronger and longer lasting over time. Now, it's probably not surprising to hear that our attitudes influence our behavior. And generally speaking, people want consistency between their attitudes and beliefs and the behaviors they engage in, right? They want those two things to match. So, for example, you probably would not have the belief or attitude that eating meat is wrong, or that eating meat is harmful to animals or to the environment, and then go off and engage in the behavior of eating a big hamburger, right? These things are not consistent. Your belief with eating meat is wrong and your behavior of going to eat a hamburger are not consistent, right? They're actually in direct contrast to each other. So we have something called cognitive dissonance. And this refers to the mental conflict that can occur when you have two contradictory thoughts or attitudes. So having two thoughts that directly contradict each other is going to produce this cognitive dissonance. And it will result in the individual adjusting their attitudes to reduce the amount of dissonance that they're actually experiencing. So let's look at some examples of this. So let's say we have an individual who smokes, but knows that smoking is dangerous to their health, right? That's a pretty common knowledge thing that people know. It's not really disputed anymore that smoking is bad for you, right? So in an individual that smokes, we have two contradictory thoughts or attitudes that are sort of going on here. The first one is I smoke, right? That's the attitude about themselves. That's their thought about their own behavior. They are a smoker. Okay, so that's the first one. The second thought or attitude is smoking leads to cancer, right? So you might see how this individual has some cognitive dissonance going on because, on the one hand, they're engaging in this behavior that, on the other hand, they know is harmful to them, right? So, how might this individual reduce the amount of dissonance that they're experiencing? And there's four different methods or ways they can do this. So, first, they might modify or slightly change one or both of the cognitions. Okay, so one or both of the thoughts. So, they might change the thought or the attitude, I smoke or I'm a smoker, to, well, I really don't smoke that much, or I'm not a heavy smoker, right? So even though smoking leads to cancer, that thought hasn't changed, that attitude hasn't changed. The other thought is not so drastically in contrast to it, right? Because if they say, well, I don't smoke very much, they're implying that they don't smoke enough to get cancer, okay? So that's one way. Another way to reduce the dissonance would be changing the perceived importance of one of the thoughts or cognitions. So instead of thinking smoking leads to cancer, they might change this to, well, the evidence is weak that smoking causes cancer, right? So now I smoke, and this new thought of there being a weak link between smoking and cancer is going to reduce the amount of cognitive dissonance that they're experiencing. Now, notice that these changes in attitude or in attitudes or thoughts don't necessarily need to be accurate, right? The evidence isn't really that weak that smoking leads to cancer. But for that individual, if they change that thought for themselves, it does reduce their own personal dissonance that they're experiencing, right? So they can just sort of say to themselves, well, that evidence isn't really that strong. Um, or they haven't really done that much evidence, and sort of just shut themselves off to that original thought of smoking leads to cancer. The third way to reduce this dissonance is by adding additional thoughts or attitudes or cognitions. So they might add something new that says, I exercise so much that it doesn't matter if I smoke. So now let's look at this. They still have the original thoughts of I smoke. They still have the original thought of smoking leads to cancer, but now they've added a third to balance out the dissonance. I work out a lot. This new thought implies that they're healthy in other ways, right? So even though they smoke, and yes, smoking leads to cancer, they're really healthy in the other things they do, right? And this implies that therefore they're less likely to get cancer from smoking because they work out a lot, right? Like they're healthy in other ways, and this will reduce the amount of dissonance that they're experiencing. And the fourth way is to reduce the dissonance by denying that the cognitions are related altogether, right? So they could have the thought that there's no evidence linking smoking and cancer. The end. Again, this is not an accurate statement, but if changing their thought to this, there is no evidence linking smoking and cancer, it will reduce their cognitive dissonance. So, using any of these four strategies is going to reduce that dissonance that the smoker is experiencing. They can engage in any one of these to successfully reduce that dissonance that they're experiencing. All right. So, let's move on to how we see others' behavior. How do we decide when we are making judgments or assumptions about someone else's characteristics and their behavior? How do we decide which information is important and which is not? So, social cognition is the process we use to understand and make sense of ourselves and those around us. And social psychologists who study how we make these judgments about others study these social cognition processes. And they have found that individuals have what they call or refer to as schemas. So these are sets of cognitions about people and social experiences. You can sort of look at these schemas as something like a category or filing system. Okay, not literally, but that's how social psychologists are looking at them. It's like a filing system. It's a category filing system. So these schemas organize information stored in your memory. So according to social psychologists, we use these schemas to organize how we recall, recognize, and categorize information about other people. Essentially, it's a framework that allows you to relate certain social stimuli with people or groups of people that you experience or that you're exposed to. So, for example, and these schemas develop, of course, throughout your life, right? Like as you interact with people more and more and you interact with the environment around you, you develop and form these schemas. So, for example, you might have the schema for teacher, which is going to be associated with certain characteristics. So when you meet someone who introduces themselves as a teacher, you're going to apply certain characteristics to them because of the schemas you have, right? Even if you know nothing else about them. So you would automatically categorize them as someone who has a certain knowledge of whatever topic they are a teacher of. So if someone says, "Oh, I'm a math teacher," then of course you, with your schema of teacher, right, you assume that they have a vast knowledge of math, right, because they're a math teacher. Or if they say they're a teacher, you categorize them as they're someone who imparts knowledge to other people, right? So you can see that these schemas are sort of like categories that we put people in. You might have a schema for mother with characteristics associated, such as warmth, nurture, or caring associated with that schema. So when someone says their mother or they introduce you to their mother, you might automatically sort of attribute that person with these characteristics of the schema of mother that you have. Okay. And the reverse can be if you have a schema of mother, um, that is more negative. Maybe if your schema of mother is, I don't know, judgmental, um, picky, or oh, what's the word? Like strict, maybe. So maybe you have a more negative view of mother. Then when someone talks about their mother or introduces you to their mother, you're going to assign them those more negative characteristics, right? So it's whatever it is that your schema is, we use that to characterize people that we come across in our environment. And these schemas result in us predicting what others are like. So even if you have very little information about them, even if you know nothing about them, you sort of predict what they're like and what characteristics they have because of these schemas. So we tend to try and fit people into the schemas that we have. Okay. Now, moving on from categorizing people based on their characteristics, now we're going to talk about understanding. So, looking at people's behavior and understanding the causes of their behavior. So, attribution theory does this. It looks at how we decide the specific causes of behavior based on observing someone doing that behavior. So, asking ourselves why the person is behaving in a particular way. So this is different from just looking at someone's behavior and getting an impression of them, right? Judging them by their behavior. But rather, this is now seeing that behavior occur and trying to understand the root cause. So why someone would engage in that behavior to begin with. And when we're looking for the cause or reason for a behavior occurring, the cause can be either situational or dispositional. Situational refers to some external cause. So the causes of the behavior or the reason the person is behaving a certain way are external or outside of that person engaging in the behavior. So, for example, let's say you drop a glass vase on the floor and it shatters everywhere. Okay. You're probably going to clean it up right away. Not because of some internal characteristic of you being a very neat and tidy person, but because the situation itself requires that you clean it up, right? You can't walk around on your floor with glass shattered all over it. It's dangerous. It could cut you. You could get seriously injured, right? So the situation itself requires that you engage in that behavior of cleaning the floor because there's glass all over the place, right? But let's say someone else sweeps and mops their floor every single day, even if nothing has spilled or broken on the floor. Now, this is more likely a dispositional cause, right, rather than a situational cause. So, this is referring to the traits or personality characteristics of a person. So, if someone is cleaning and mopping their floor every single day, even if there's no mess to clean up, then we would say it's a dispositional cause of their behavior, right? They're a neat or tidy person. Okay, so see the difference there? Someone cleaning the floor because the situation requires that they clean the floor. There's glass everywhere, it's not safe. They have to clean the floor. Versus someone who's cleaning a floor because of some personality or characteristic trait that they have of being neat and tidy. Okay, so situational versus dispositional. Now, even though this attribution theory, for the most part, accurately predicts the causes of one's behavior most of the time, so if we're just looking at people's behavior and saying, okay, is it situational or is it dispositional? If this can be looked at objectively every single time, then this would be a very accurate way of predicting the causes of people's behavior. But as humans, we don't always process information accurately or in such a straightforward way, right? We have things called biases that can get in the way of processing this information about the cause of someone's behavior. It's really hard for us to simply look at the cause of behavior without letting any of our own biases get in the way when we're looking at that. I am, as you all know, and I've talked about before, I'm a behavior analyst. And that is what we do. We look at the causes of one's behavior purely. And it's very hard to do sometimes because if you don't assign any bias and you objectively look at the environmental cause of someone's behavior, um, you essentially take blame off the person. And in our society, that is not the norm, right? So we tend to assign blame to someone, let's say if they've committed a crime, right? So we might say, um, that person is a bad person, or we call them a criminal, right? And we assign sort of all these labels to them. But as a behavior analyst, we would look at a criminal and say they're not a bad person, their behavior isn't bad, it's just what their environment caused them to do, right? Someone who steals and holds someone up at gunpoint, yes, that's a terrible thing. And we have laws put in place so that people don't walk around holding people up at gunpoint and stealing their money. And for good reason, we have those laws, right? But as a behavior analyst, we look at that and we don't say, well, that person did that because they're a bad person. We say, well, um, you know, perhaps their environment is such that they're starving. They haven't had a job in 2 years. Maybe they lost their home. Maybe they lost their family. There are probably a lot of environmental factors that are going on, um, that that are the reason for why they engage in that behavior. And we don't look at people as um, you know, sort of a lost cause. We don't look at criminals as a lost cause, right? We believe that we can predict their behavior based on the environmental factors that are in place and change it. If we can change those environmental factors, we can change their future behavior. But that is not the norm of most people unless you've been sort of trained in that way of thinking, and it takes a really long time to sort of adjust your way of thinking and looking at behavior that way, because it's really hard not to let your biases get in the way when you're looking at causes of behavior. But for the most part, people do have biases and they do affect how we look at causes of behavior of other people. And there are four typical attribution biases that can occur when we're looking at others' behavior. The first is the halo effect. So, this occurs when you have an initial understanding of a person having certain positive traits, and you use that knowledge you have to infer that they have other positive traits or additional positive traits as well, even if you don't know for sure that they do. So, for example, let's say you know someone is kind, loving, and patient. You may then infer other positive traits as well. Maybe that they're empathetic, they're selfless, they're giving, and the list goes on, right? Maybe that they're a good leader, right? And this can also be said of negative traits. So if you observe someone with negative traits, you may then assume or infer that they have other negative traits as well. You know, a lot of times when people are looking at criminals and behaviors that they engage in, we'll assign all sorts of things to them. Um, that negative traits that maybe they haven't exhibited, but we assume that because they had this one negative trait or they engaged in this one negative behavior, then all of these other negative things must be true about them as well. Okay, so that's the halo effect. It leads to a misperception of other people, either thinking too highly of them or thinking less of them than they deserve. You essentially overgeneralize their traits, either positive or negative. The second bias that can occur is the assumed similarity bias. So, this is when you assume that other people are just like you when meeting them for the first time. So, for example, if you know someone taking all the same classes of you, let's say you've seen them in all of your classes and you know they're getting the same degree as you might assume that you have all kinds of other things in common as well, even if maybe you don't, right? Just from the first time meeting them and you've seen them in other classes, you're going to assume that you guys have things in common. It's really just assuming that others are like you, right? That's what the assumed similarity bias is. And this often reduces how accurate you are in your judgment of that person's behavior. And this happens a lot when people are meeting others for the first time. We tend to look for commonalities. If you think about if you've ever been in a room with people you don't know, um, you try to find common ground, right? That's how you essentially get a conversation started or keep a conversation going with someone you don't know and have just met. You find something that you both have in common and you sort of talk about that, right? So it's the same idea. You're sort of making this assumption when you first meet someone that you do have things in common, even if maybe you don't. Okay. The third bias that can occur is what is called the self serving bias. So, this is when you look at the outcomes of someone's behavior. And if they're successful, then we often attribute the causes of that behavior to things such as personal factors, right? So, something good that the person did. So, if they engage in a behavior and that behavior produces some sort of successful consequence, then we say, oh, well, it was because of something they personally did, right? But if their behavior results in an unsuccessful consequence or a failure, we'll attribute the cause of that behavior to external factors instead. So let me give you an example of sort of how this works. So let's say you get a really good grade on your exam. You'll likely attribute this to your own personal self, right? So you engaged in a behavior, you took the exam, the result of that was successful, you got a really good grade. We're going to say that the cause of that behavior then was due to personal factors. So you'll most likely say, well, I studied really hard. Or you'll say something like, yes, I'm a really good student. Of course, I got a good grade on that exam. But if you get a bad grade on your exam, if you don't do well, you're most likely not going to attribute that to your own self. You're not going to turn around, just like you did with the good grade, you're not going to turn around with the bad grade and say, well, I didn't study hard enough. I should have studied longer, I should have studied harder, or I didn't work hard enough this time around. Instead, people tend to look at external factors in the unsuccessful or failure instances. So things like, well, I think the professor doesn't really like me, so that's why they gave me that grade. Or I didn't have enough time on to write the paper. Or there wasn't enough resources for me, right? So when you're unsuccessful or you fail, you're more likely, and when you see others fail as well, it's not just only yourself, but others as well, you're most likely to attribute those failures to external factors rather than personal factors. Finally, the fourth bias that can occur is the fundamental attribution error. This is when we attribute the causes of behavior of others mostly to dispositional causes. So, this is, remember, as said before, there are situational causes and there are dispositional causes. But people tend to attribute the cause of other people's behavior mostly to those dispositional causes, which, as I said before, and we say that's due to the person's characteristics, right? And we tend to minimize the importance of the situational cause, which is outside of the person. So, this is what I was talking about when I first started talking about these biases and the viewpoint of a behavior analyst. We make every effort not to make this fundamental attribution error. We emphasize the importance of the situational cause, of the environmental cause, and we sort of play down the dispositional cause. We don't really look at a person's characteristics as a cause for behavior. We look to the environment. What is controlling behavior in their situation? But most people look at or attribute more of the causes to one's dispositional causes. And this is something we tend to do overall in Western cultures. We place more emphasis on the importance of personality characteristics of the individual rather than looking at the environmental influences over that behavior. So, just an example of this, let's say you have someone who's always late to work. You might say things like, well, they're lazy, they're disrespectful of people's time, they're sort of blase about work, they don't really care. That is a dispositional cause, right? You're looking and you're attributing someone's characteristics as to the reason they're engaging in that behavior of being late rather than looking at the situational causes, which is the person's environment. Maybe they have to drive from very, very far away. Maybe they have a long commute and traffic is unpredictable. Maybe they have a long commute and they have kids they have to drop off at school and get out the door. For those of you that have kids, I have two. Of course, we're not trying to get out the door in the morning to school anymore because of the pandemic, which is actually kind of really nice. Mornings can be very stressful with kids. And I am someone who is always early whenever I'm going anywhere or to a meeting, um, or when I was in school, for classes and things like that. I've always been an early person. Like if I'm 15 minutes early, to me, that's on time. But when you're getting kids out the door in the morning, all of that changes. And I would be sometimes late to many things because now it's not just me getting out the door. I have to get two other little people out the door as well, right? And get them dressed and get their shoes on, make sure they grab their lunch and their backpack, and so on and so forth. So that's a huge environmental factor that if you're just saying, well, they're lazy, right? They're late to work because they're lazy. What about all those environmental factors that might be taking place? Getting kids out of the house, traffic, living far away. Maybe they don't have a car and they have to take a train or a bus that runs late sometimes, and so on and so forth. You can think of all kinds of environmental factors. So, this is looking more to the situational causes of the behavior rather than the dispositional causes.